There we are. Okay. Can you you hear? You don't need to see me now, but I hope you can hear me. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay.
very good. Yes.
Yep. Okay. All right. So that's the introduction, really. I'll just go straight into the discussion. Definitions of consumers, right from the start. This is interesting because even the definition of consumer, I think, has its dangers. And in the United Nations, as you can see there, I've given you the definition in the United Nations guidelines: a natural person, regardless of nationality, acting primarily for personal, family, or household purposes. The emphasis there is on the word primarily, because gradually there has been a degree of flexibility introduced into the definitions. And in fact, the full text in the UN guidelines says, while recognizing that member states may adopt differing definitions to address specific domestic needs. There is greater flexibility coming in to the definition as more and more, as for example, use mobile phones at work and at home. Many people, of course, have always lived over the shop, or they've lived on their home has been intimately connected to their work, of course, in agriculture, which is still the world's largest economic sector. That is the case. Indeed, some countries, China, for example, defines all peasant farmers as consumers. Everything that they buy, even if it's farming equipment, is covered by the consumer protection legislation. However, I do have some concerns that in practice, the definition of consumer tends only to be with regard to transactions. And that is even in the Brazilian case, which is one of the most broad legislations. Nevertheless, we have definition in Article 2 of the Code. A consumer is any physical person or corporate entity, that's interesting also, corporate entity, who acquires or uses products or services as a final user. And then there is then a difference between the definitions of products, by which it means goods, physical goods, and services. Goods or products as any movable or immovable material or immaterial asset, that's uncontroversial. But then services are any activity provided in the consumer market through remuneration, including those of banking, financial credit, and insurance, etc. Interestingly, one concern which I have over the years is that there is a danger, as I see it, that consumer protection will only be seen as shoppers' rights. And I've witnessed over the years, I first started working on consumer protection a very long time ago, but I was introduced into the National Consumer Council to work on matters of public services, many of which were not paid for at the point of use. Health in British National Health Service is one example, but even social security services, for example, was my speciality. My background was actually in social policy originally. So I was surprised even to find that in Brazil, services are described as transaction-based, and that is where consumer law tends to apply. I'm going to try and move faster. Dictionary definitions it's usually better to talk about consumers of goods, users of service, and in Spanish it's consumidores and usuarios. There tends to be great confusion often in the English language when we use consumers to cover goods and services. That's just a detail. On policy questions, there are two opposing trends, talking of recent trends. Now, interestingly, the rejection of consumerism or to put it another way, well, consumerism, the emphasis there is on the ism. There is a perception among many, particularly among many NGOs, non-governmental organizations, that there is also an ideology of consumerism, that it's all about consuming more. Now, I think this, personally, I think this has been exaggerated, but nevertheless, yes, perhaps it has existed. I think it's beginning to retreat in the face of questions of social and environmental responsibility. And that is something which I welcome. But it still doesn't mean that we're not consumers in those respects. My view is that we do have environmental and social responsibilities even though we are consumers. I mean, I've been at conferences where people have actually rejected the use of the word consumer. I think that's a very extreme position. But one interesting historical point is that the actual concept of ethical consumers is quite old. In the late 18th century, at the time of the movement to abolish slavery, there were boycotts mounted in European countries, in France and in Britain, against the consumption of slave-produced sugar. Now, that is so long ago. This is about the time of the French Revolution. And yet, here we are today still discussing the need to integrate these concepts into consumer policy discussion. I've already told you about my concerns about the restriction to shoppers' rights. So the interesting thing about these two trends is that the restriction to shoppers' rights is narrowing consumer protection, whereas the inclusion of social and environmental responsibility is widening consumer protection. Both of these trends I can observe in the present discussions. So moving on, it's often said that that consumer protection can be rather mundane. It can be very middle class and middle aged, but in fact it has quite a turbulent history. And I just give two examples. Two major European revolutions started with consumer protests about the price of bread. The French Revolution really kicked off in a big way on the 13th of July 1789 rather than the 14th of July. The Parisians burnt down the customs posts which were used to levy taxes on bread entering Paris from outside. This was a protectionist device by the cartel of the Parisian bakers. So the crowds of people burnt down those customs posts as a way of bringing down the price of bread. International Women's Day, which saw the beginning of the Russian Revolution, not the second one, not the Bolshevik Revolution, but the Menshevik Revolution, what's known as the February Revolution, started off with a mass protest by women against the price of bread. There's no particular moral to draw here. I'm just saying perhaps it's actually much more exciting than we give credit for. And I mean, I like to think that there is a Brazilian dimension to this, because it's very important, as I explained to my Russian colleagues, that the Brazilian Consumer Defense Code was very much a part of the process of democratization in 1990 when it was passed. It followed from the end of the dictatorship, and it was very much a part of that process of bringing rights into the equation, supported by the new constitution. While we're not talking about French and Russian revolutions here, we now are nevertheless referring to a very important political context. Moving forward to the role of the United States, also very interesting. The American contribution to consumer rights has been extremely volatile and at times contradictory. In the early years, of course, I should point out that many of the modern consumer associations, including in Brazil, Proteste, were really inspired by the commercial model of testing of consumer products and then selling a magazine for revenue. And IDEC also, to some extent, but Proteste was more exclusively focused on that one function. And this function was pioneered by the United States in the 1930s with the Consumers Union, which publishes consumer reports, and to this day is the world's largest consumer organization. And then after the Second World War, this model, rather commercially based model, spread to Belgium, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, where you had product testing magazines. And so the modern consumer testing model took off after the Second World War. And in 1960, those members who had developed this model established the International Organization of Consumer Unions, which has now been renamed Consumers International, for whom I worked until last year. And this was very much inspired by the United States. In 1962, President Kennedy spoke to Congress about the consumer rights and his first principles, which he laid out there: safety, information, choice, which I'll come to in a minute, and representation. These are all now integrated into the UN guidelines for consumer protection, which were first agreed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1985. But here's the paradox. No doubt at all, the initial inspiration for this idea of consumer rights came from the US and from President Kennedy's speech. But in 1985, in the General Assembly, the United States opposed the adoption of the UN guidelines for consumer protection. This was during the Reagan administration, and the American delegation said that the world did not need a consumer policeman. However, I think eventually they were persuaded to vote in favor after a great debate, and the guidelines were subsequently adopted. They were revised in 1999 to include the promotion of sustainable consumption, a very large section of the guidelines, and a clear proof that sustainability and environmental matters are very much a part now of the consumer landscape. And in 2015, there was a major revision in which I was heavily involved, and representing Consumers International, and there were major, I believe, improvements to the guidelines. There were also a couple of points which we did not succeed in getting across, but one very important one is the first one listed there: the insertion of state-owned enterprises. Amazingly, until 2015, the guidelines did not explicitly refer to state-owned businesses. So that would include many electricity, water services. These were not clearly included in the guidelines. There was an ambiguity. Well, I'm happy to say they were brought in under Article 3, I think it is, of the guidelines, Article 2 of the guidelines. And that's a major economic sector, therefore included. Business practices, I actually largely repeated what was already in the guidelines, but it indicated that businesses should also consider themselves to be covered by the guidelines. Alternative dispute resolution, well, Claudia is far more expert than I am in that field. E-commerce, which was obviously needed to update the guidelines, where they largely adopted many of the provisions of the OECD guidelines. Financial services, public utilities, they were previously there, but only to a much lesser degree. The important addition to that sector in 2015 was universal service. The objective of universal service was included for the first time. Tourism was included in 2015, and Claudia was very instrumental in that. And also a brief, one area which has been neglected by the guidelines, still remains neglected, is travel. Commuter travel, travelers are not well served by the UN guidelines. It's a matter of some concern. And finally, international cooperation. Now, the importance of the guidelines. Obviously I'm biased because I was heavily involved with them. A lot of improvements were made. What we lost was intellectual property. It was not included in the guidelines. The official position of the US delegation, which basically vetoed their inclusion, because that's how it works in these international negotiating forums. If they're based on consensus, that means one country can actually torpedo the will of all the others. And this was the case. I think it was Japan also didn't want to include intellectual property. We failed on that, but the others were all major advances. The importance of that is that the guidelines are used in countries all over the world, and they pop up. Various sections of the guidelines appear actually in legislation, sometimes even in constitutions. The lists of consumer rights are included. And this, therefore, is very important. But there is one factor I want to point out to you, which I'll come to in a minute. And when we get to the most famous article, which is Article 5, the legitimate needs, as I put there in parenthesis, these are not rights. The United Nations guidelines do not have convention status. They are not legally enforceable in a court of law. And there's huge debate. It'd be interesting for us to discuss that maybe in questions and answers. What they do have, however, is the universal approval of all United Nations member states. And there's no doubt at all that they have been immensely influential. So it'd be interesting for us to discuss the legal standing later. I just want to draw your attention to A and B there. The legitimate needs are a long list. There are 11 of the legitimate needs. There were previously 8. And the new ones, or was it 7? Yes, because there were 4 new ones. Access by consumers to essential goods and services I've already referred to. That was a major breakthrough. Protection of vulnerable and disadvantaged consumers, also a major breakthrough. And of course, this is something where the Brazilian Consumer Code already led the way. Health and safety is one that you'll be very familiar with. That was in the original 1985 version. And then I'll go down to some of the other ones. The protection of the economic interests of consumers is a euphemism actually for competition policy. I won't dwell on that now. Information to enable them to make informed choices. I just want to say a word about this. There is something of an obsession among the consumer associations about choice. And many people talk about the right to choice. There is no right to choice. It's not always feasible. Where you have natural monopolies, it's simply impossible. And when it's been forced into markets, as it has in the European energy market, for example, it's frequently been a failure. There is, however, a right to adequate information to enable consumers to make choices where such choices are possible. So that's something which I think is important to clarify. Consumer education, again, very good work done by EDEC over the years. United Nations guidelines continue in the legitimate needs, availability of effective consumer dispute resolution and redress, freedom to form consumer groups, and the opportunity for them to present their views in decision-making processes affecting them. Brazil led the way here. Consumer associations even existed during the dictatorship. And other countries have had the same experience. Portugal too, that also happened. And they partly led the way. Immense courage they must have shown in advocating the rights of consumers at the time. And in 1987, EDEC was the first of the Latin American consumer associations to join Consumers International, far ahead of all the other Southern Hemisphere countries. So Brazil has played a crucial role in the development of consumer organizations. These are the 2 new ones, the other 2 new ones, guidelines, the legitimate needs that have been inserted into the guidelines. Very important, both of them. In the context of electronic commerce, this subparagraph J is known often as the equivalence principle, that the level of protection for consumers using electronic commerce should be not less than other forms, that is the more traditional forms of shopping in shops or even, or mail order, for example. And at Consumers International, we undertook a survey in 2013, and we found actually that in e-commerce, there were fewer consumer protections than there were in conventional commerce. And that's worrying, because as e-commerce expands, this suggests, therefore, that the overall level of consumer protection would decline. So we were very keen, therefore, to bring that principle of equivalence into the guidelines. And it has come to pass, but I'm still worried. I'm also worried about the way that legal sanctions are often applied against consumers through electronic means, not through any communication. They simply, for example, technical protection measures when consumers use on their computers, draw down digital products such as music or film, and also potentially books, and therefore in the long run educational materials. They can be sanctioned by technical protection measures, which are a kind of device implanted into people's computers to stop them from functioning properly. This, I think, is draconian. I've campaigned against it in the OECD and in the UN and failed. And I think that's going to be one of the great struggles in the future, which has been the defending consumer rights in the digital world, where I think there is a danger that this will be taken away completely from the judicial framework and end up being, we will have technologically administered sanctions. The last one there, protection of consumer privacy and the global free flow of information, clearly privacy of enormous importance. That was the subject of a big row between Germany and the United States. Germany wanted stronger mechanisms for privacy. The United States wanted the global free flow of information. The Secretariat very diplomatically put together a recommendation which would simply combine those two arguments, and then everybody was happy. But it was, I mean, the Germans were right. We needed stronger defense of privacy. Another important matter for the future, as identity becomes not just something that you worry about on Facebook, but becomes a vital question for any credit transactions, but also, as we're now seeing in India, becomes a prerequisite for access to public services. People need increasingly identities. So this is another vital matter for the future. Okay, model laws. Could we implement all these wonderful principles by model law? Now, model law is probably applicable more to Latin America than anywhere else on the planet. And I think there's a reason for this, a fairly obvious one, really. There are two major languages with similar legal traditions based on Roman law. If model laws don't work in Latin America, one wonders if they'll work anywhere. And indeed, there have been some very good model laws done in Latin America, including the model law on family insolvency for Latin America and the Caribbean, which was published in 2011. And among the team of experts, there was a lady called Claudia Lima Marquez, who advised the preparation of this model law. My concerns, however, about this became something of a fashion. After the relative successes of Latin America, people perfectly understandably said, let's have model laws for Asia and Africa, where they're still writing their legislation. Can't we make it much easier if we have model laws? Actually, I have my doubts. First of all, the sheer complexity. Which models do you adopt? Civil or common law, private or public, civil or criminal, contract law and commercial law? That's relatively simple, actually, but hard law, soft law, domestic or international standards. Another very difficult issue is horizontal and vertical. If I could just explain that. By horizontal law measures, one refers to principles across all of the sectors, such as, for example, unfair contract terms. That's not peculiar to one sector. It's a general principle, or unfair, or the abolition of unfair commercial practices. Vertical laws would be sectoral. They would be about food standards. They would be about maybe electricity or financial services. Can all of that fit into a model law? I think the danger is that we will make the task simply too great, too complex. The other, of course, great problem for Africa and Asia is, well, in Africa, you have the three colonial traditions, Portuguese, French, and British. And what would tend to happen actually in practice, when I saw the draft model law for Africa, which was drafted by a very eminent lawyer for Consumers International, I was extremely disappointed. It was basically cutting and pasting of well, not even British law, but English law, and very badly done. Now, just because it's been badly done in one case doesn't mean that the principle generally is to be abandoned. But there is the danger that one will tend, that the expert lawyers will tend to cut and paste law with which they are already familiar, often from European or American jurisdictions. And obviously we should borrow from other traditions. Clearly they should be studied. Anyway, the way we resolve this after what we thought was the failure in the drafting of an African consumer protection model law was we moved towards a checklist. And the result, I think, was really quite good. We would have a checklist which would consider whether, instead of just developing an exhaustive model law, we would check whether the different aspects were covered, what were the legal sources for consumer protection that already existed, for a start, commercial practices and advertisement regulation, the form of the contract, regulation of contract, competition law, if that didn't exist, should it be incorporated into consumer protection law, specific industry regulations, dispute resolution mechanisms, and other generic consumer issues. So the trend that we adopted certainly was away from a complete and finalized model law and moving towards a checklist approach, making sure that all the different aspects were covered, but also, this is crucial, leaving open the possibility of introduction of past traditions from the countries developing their legislation. There is often an assumption on the part, I've witnessed it, from European experts in Africa, that they're writing on a blank page, that there's no law at all, no legal traditions already existing there. Well, I did some very interesting work last year the year before last, in Morocco, where the UN asked me to be part of a team where we did a peer review of Moroccan consumer protection law and policy. And when we went to Rabat and met our very helpful, very gifted and expert legal colleagues in Morocco, they were very keen to demonstrate to us how they were moving fast towards approximation with European legislation, as indeed they were. My concern was that this might be just a blind copying and pasting of European legislation, and certainly some of that did happen. But when I asked the question, don't you have historic, traditional consumer protection defenses in Morocco? They were almost embarrassed. They thought this was almost looking back, and they wanted to prove that they were modern, and adopting European legislation seemed to be a modern approach. But when I pressed them on the matter, and one doesn't have an argument in Morocco, they're very polite people, but when I pushed a little harder, it emerged, very, very interestingly, that there are consumer protections in Morocco that have existed for 1,000 years. And the Arabic word is mohtasib. The mohtasib is what the French call le maître du souk, the master of the souk. The souk, of course, is the old market inside the Medina, the lovely old cities that one has in North Africa. And basically, in modern jargon, the master of the souk was the ombudsman. The ombudsman is a very modern concept that started in Scandinavia and spread through Northern Europe and is now very widely adopted, including, I've observed with great pleasure, in Latin America, where there are public service ombudsmen. The El Defensor del Pueblo in Peru is a major public figure. But this ombudsman has existed, has the right of dispute resolution, and has the right of product inspection. This has existed for 1,000 years. Now, the danger, therefore, in adopting model laws is that you may simply pass over existing traditions that could be integrated into the new legislation. So the final section, then I'd like to go on to the codification, and I'll just, and then we'll finish. Of course, there are many famous national legal codes. The most famous I've already mentioned, the Code Napoleon of 1804. Interestingly, it's Belgium is the country with the most complete transposition of the Napoleonic Code to this day. Of course, Napoleon, his territory included Belgium during the time, and much of it is still in existence in Belgian law. Quebec has a legal code. I know Claudia knows it well. But on the whole, it's more of a technical and legal alignment of terms, making language consistent. It's not really conceptual. Russia had a particular problem, and this was why they wanted to examine the possibility of a civil code. Now, I worked in Russia, the European Commission, in 1994, 1995, and indeed ever since. But the problem which they had in the 90s was that every ministry was writing its own law, and they would have their own foreign expert that would come to help them. And of course, they were all separately writing laws. And the laws, of course, unsurprisingly, became mutually contradictory. And so Russia finds itself inheriting laws which conflict with each other. And that is one of the reasons why they're interested in having a codification process, just for, I should add, just for consumer protection. And that's why I pointed them in the direction of the Brazilian code. And so what I'm saying now is largely inherited from what I said to the Russians. I've already gone through the history of the new constitution, so I think I'll press on, except 25th anniversary. That was a great party in 2015, and I was there. I'm delighted to be so. Let me go to the next slide. I think what's distinctive is the principles and goals, the objectives of the Consumer Protection Code. Explicit social objectives, public policy and social interests are actually in the text of the code. Equality between economic actors, which of course is only theoretical in Western legislation under contract law, and under contract law it's largely a myth. Solidarity with the vulnerable, explicitly written into the legislation. A hierarchy of legislation, but the code stands alone and supersedes the civil code. Of course, to the Russians, this was very, very challenging. They could not conceive of the civil code being superseded. That was a very intense debate. Suppression of unfair contract terms and commercial practices. But the crucial principle here is that conduct supersedes contract. Now, this was 1990. This was in the Brazilian code. Now, in 1992 or 1993, we then had the Unfair Contract Terms Directive in Europe, which partly moved in that direction. It wasn't really until the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive of 2005, later updated in 2009, in the European Union. So it wasn't really until then that the EU caught up with Brazil in terms of principles of conduct superseding terms of contract. The other strength of the CDC, it addresses all three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judiciary. And I was very interested to see how there was the accusation of judicial activism, even judicial terrorism the accusations came from business about the positive role expected of the judiciary. I won't go, I think I'm running out of time. I just want to note there, the principle of proportionality, I think it's fantastic that it's in there. I'm having huge difficulties in the OECD persuading them to introduce proportionality into much of their guidelines. A real struggle, I could tell you about that maybe in the later discussion. Let's see here. I know I won't, that's just for completeness that I put that there. Regulatory impact, emphasis on unfair commercial practices has been generally accepted by business. I understand from what I've read. The primacy of the code over sectoral legislation, that's very important indeed. Very high level of public recognition, second only to the Constitution. A large number of inquiries. Applicability to public services has been confirmed at the retail level rather than the upstream level. There's quite a discussion one can have about that. And the collective actions and role of associations, all these are very positive. So my conclusions, this is what I said to the Russians. There's clearly a strong argument for codification in many jurisdictions. And this is being considered around the world in various parts. But it's a very big decision. And the factors and questions to consider are the following: sectoral or generic. We sort of suggested halfway between the two. A horizontal application of consumer protection is one possibility. Is it normative, creating new law, or is it a compilation of existing law? The concept of codification really is that it compiles existing law, but the CDC goes beyond that. Hierarchy of legislation in relation to the civil code. The tripartite I've already dealt with. Policy objectives being explicit I've already dealt with. Reflecting international undertakings, to what extent should the code do that? But of course the big tactical question is codification is a long process. You know, the French code took, I think, Thierry Bourgoigny was chairing it for a while, our colleague from Montreal, and now back in Belgium, and it took, I think, about 11 years to do the French code. So the big question is, if there are other priorities that the government wants for its legislative timetable, will this prevent them from achieving that? And that's a very fair point. I would not presume to give a dogmatic response. In my humble opinion, I conclude, are model laws needed for countries starting legislation? I think there is scope for, certainly one should look at other legislation, of course, but one should start by defining the public policy objectives as the Brazilian Code did. And that's the important point. What do you want to achieve? Then I think one should use the checklist approach to cover all the different areas. And it may be that one can then draw on particular models from around the world, and indeed model laws, which could then be integrated into text. And I would give the Brazilian Code as an example of a standalone system with a clear public policy orientation. That's the nearest thing I have to advice for those of you who may be working on this, but of course I might be wrong. So there we are, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and we've kept reasonably well to time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor dear Robin. I used to call you professor, sorry. For me, you are a professor. Indeed, it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you very much. And I think you touch important issues. And we have now some minutes to have questions and answers. I want to begin with the idea how important is the Article 4 for our Consumer Code that shows principles or public policy.
Sorry, do you mean Article 5? Do you mean Article 4 of what?
4 and 5, yes, indeed.
Do you mean of the UN guidelines, do you mean?
No, the Brazilian Consumer Code.
Oh, the Brazilian Code. Oh, right.
Yes.
Well, yes. I've got it here.
Yes, because the public policy, at the time the Brazilian Code was written, the people ask why put public policy in a code,
yes,
in
I see.
Law.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it was a visionary from the time, because if you have this clear, you point at this, you have clear objectives, and I think perhaps this is a good way to make this checklist approach, because what you need is these objectives. Can you reflect on this, please?
Yeah, well, you've answered your own question, Claudia. I agree with you entirely. I think this isn't something that you should have to defend. I think that's one of the great strengths of the code, that these things are actually explicitly stated from the outset. Now, of course, one looks back to the historical context. This was, part of the democratization process, but there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, consumer rights should be part of the democratization process. So, no, one of the reasons why I admire the Brazilian Code is precisely those. I'd forgotten the numbers of those particular provisions. Yes, I think it's precisely because of that explicit nature of the statement, and it sets a very, very clear framework. And just to add to that, the interesting thing is, I've read pretty extensively around the subject, and I've in Brazilian publications, and I've seen that actually quite a lot of the business world, which was often so hostile to the concept of the code, actually have accepted that the existence of the machinery of application, which is the PROCONs, is actually very useful. It's been useful to them. And the fact is that until 2010, the Brazilian economy went racing ahead. It didn't really damage the economy. The one serious legal challenge to the code came from the banking sector, and the banking sector lost. It was because of the constitutional, this is another important point actually, because consumer protection was specifically mentioned in the constitution of Brazil, in the new constitution of, was it 88, I think? Yeah. That led, if I understand rightly, the Supreme Court to judge that the code did indeed apply to all the details of financial services. I mean, it seems to me when you look at Article 2 that it was ridiculous for the banking sector to try to say that the code didn't apply to them, but it helped, that constitutional provision helped the the Supreme Court to come down on the side of the consumer in that case.
Thank you very much. And I have one question before our students come. Now with this COVID-19 pandemic outbreak, we are seeing a new legislation trying to reduce consumer rights. What do you think this, because you spoke also about this constitutional guarantee to consumer protection, but now we are seeing this trend to reduce consumer rights because of economic arguments, or I don't know exactly why.
I think that will happen. I think there is a danger that consumer rights will be reduced in order, and the argument will be in order to justify, in order to reinforce the viability of the companies. I mean, I heard this in person in the OECD in the financial crisis. So let me take you back to the financial crisis, because it's the same thing. During the financial crisis, there were various models put forward under the G20 for increasing consumer rights in the financial crisis. And the response of the bankers was almost, I mean, if it wasn't so sad, it would be comical, was, we can't afford this because we're in the middle of a crisis. But of course, the crisis was brought on by financial malpractice to a large degree. So the bankers wanted it both ways. They want to carry out the malpractice which led to the crisis, but then they said we can't afford to improve consumer rights because we're in the middle of a financial crisis, and we cannot afford to allow consumers these rights because then the banks will collapse. And so I think this will happen. I think the companies will say, we can't allow greater rights because we will collapse. And it's also happening in other ways. The other area of indirect consumer protection, which is under threat, is competition policy. You're going to get increasing tendencies towards monopolies. And the reason that will be put for that, I mean, I'm not talking about natural monopolies. I mean, I have views that natural monopolies we should not ignore. And we're trying to pretend that some monopolies are not natural when they are natural. But in the case of monopolies which are not natural monopolies, in other words, it's just the acquisition by companies of other companies, in that area too, it will be justified on the grounds that we need economies of scale. We can't afford competition because it will drive prices down. And at this terrible time of economic crisis, we can't allow that to happen. So I think your fears are entirely justified. But it's not, I'd say it's not just consumer protection policy, it's also competition policy.
Thank you very much. I don't know if there are some questions off the floor. We have students from Brazil, professors.
Hi.
Dr. Laís Beckson, please.
Hello.
Hi. Really nice to see you again, Professor Simpson. We
Hello.
met in 2016 in Quebec.
Oh,
and
right.
I would like to add a special one of your qualities in your resume, which is being a great singer. As I recall, we will add that at your resume, being the best singer ever, especially.
Thank you.
I would like to ask you, if I may, regarding competition, how do you think that consumer law may help increase competition?
Oh, right.
And or even in that area, if you may enlighten us with any thoughts on that matter. Thank you very much.
Right. I think consumer law can increase competition. I think by insisting on clear contract terms, and I think by insisting on better disclosure, that increases the transparency of the market, and that can increase competition. However, I have certain reservations about relying only on disclosure to improve competition, and this is a sensitive subject for me in the OECD Consumer Committee, on which I sat for 10 years. many members of the committee, and they were people from all the OECD countries, from all the consumer protection agencies in all the OECD countries. And there was a tendency to assume that that was all you needed to do. All you needed to do was provide greater transparency, and consumers then would be okay, because they would be the protagonists in the marketplace and they would exercise choice in this wonderful rational fashion. Of course, the real world is not like that. And so I think therefore that consumer protection policy can certainly increase competition, but I think we shouldn't over rely on competition policy, because it can only really help consumer protection by operating through transparency. And the reality is that so many consumers don't actually read terms and conditions, and probably will never read terms and conditions. But what I think we do need, however, to increase competition is also to adopt many of the provisions that are in the Brazilian Code, but also in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive of the European Union. I'm not saying you should just adopt that directive, but many of the provisions of clearly outlawing certain practices. Both in the Unfair Contract Terms Directive and in the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, there are lists of practices which are illegal. And that you get rid of those and you will increase competition. And because what you're doing is then you're having competition between honest traders. Now, I know what many of you will be thinking, but what if new abuses are invented? And of course, that's right. So what the great advantage of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive of the EU is that they reinforce the list, and it's 31 kinds of abuse are outlawed. They reinforce that with certain principles, and you can also draw on the principles to outlaw a particular practice. If you think a new practice, which you haven't encountered, is not on the list, also requires action by consumer protection agencies, then you can use those principles to strike down a practice or a contract term. So by striking down abusive commercial practice and by striking down unfair contract terms, you may reduce the kind of the blinding variety of contracts which are on the market. But what you're doing is you're getting rid of the abusive ones. So you then have real competition between different providers, all of them operating on the basis of fair contract terms and fair commercial practices. That's how we should be promoting competition.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. We have more 5 minutes for a last question on the floor. If not, I will make the last one is about your example of model laws in Africa, right, and the failure. Do you think it's because of the different legal culture between these different former colonies from Europe? Yes. Because we are trying to build a group with a colleague from Macau, Professor Wei Dan, that yes, you know. I know her. Yes. China, Brazil, and African countries that speak Portuguese to try to make something smaller, perhaps in the checklist approach, like it's exactly that I want to ask you. But do you think this could be more successful than yes, Pan-African model law?
Yes, I do. And I think the reason for that, if you look at those countries, none of them were themselves colonial powers. So there isn't the tradition, there isn't the concept that law is being imposed upon them. Mm-hmm. So I think that it's more likely to be successful. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate my worries about model law concept. The Anglophone one in Africa did not work precisely because it was only Anglophone. It didn't draw on the French tradition at all. There's very good French legislation, but that was put to one side. They simply cut and paste and to an absurd degree of detail, some of the British legislation, some of which is okay, but it's personally I would like to pick and choose from the best of all the different legislations. So I mean, I think even then there are some dangers with a group from around the world. If you only concentrate on legislation from the Lusophone traditions, I mean, there will be other traditions that will be worth looking at. And personally, I find the French legislation more valid in the African context than I do the English legislation, but that's just my rather arbitrary experience. But I think yes, the fact that those countries are so varied is a good thing. Brazil, Lusophone Africa, Macau, these are very, very different kinds of territories, and none of them have been colonial powers. So I can understand that it could actually be a much more equal exchange. So I wish you luck, but I would still urge you, but I mean, you're well enough informed, Claudia, to know that there is very good legislation in many other jurisdictions too. So not to only to focus exclusively on the Lusophone.
Well, thanks very much. I'm sorry to say that we reach our time, but right. I want really to thank you very much for this wonderful effort from the UK to us in a very clear and a very pedagogical way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I read the expression of some colleagues, professors, and also students that hear you, that they enjoy a lot and learn also a lot for your great experience. Thank you very much.
Claudia, while I remember, you know, I've sent you the paper on my Russian paper,
yes.
In English, of course, and I would encourage people to read it. I've actually written to you, Claudia. There's just one little sentence I was worried about, but I think that you know, I'm not a lawyer, and so I've tried to write it in you know, non-lawyer language, and it was a very, very interesting experience. And I think I think what I tried to do was draw out the particular features of the Brazilian code that make it, I think, applicable in many other countries.
Perfect. We will do that. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
right.
stay home and stay healthy. This is the most important now.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.